In August of 1944, the stench inside that cargo hold could turn your stomach if you let yourself think about it too long. Salt from the ocean spray mixed with diesel fumes and the particular smell of human bodies packed together without proper ventilation, 84 women breathing the same recycled air for days on end. Greta Möller had wedged herself into a corner where the hull met the floor, her spine pressed against metal that stayed cold no matter how warm the air got, and she kept her knees pulled up tight against her chest. Hidden there, tucked between her ribs and the rough fabric of her uniform, was a photograph she had no business keeping. Just a small square of paper, but it carried more weight than anything else she owned. The whispers never stopped down there in the dark. German words passed from mouth to mouth, each woman sharing whatever terrible thing she'd heard about where they were going, what would happen when they arrived. Someone claimed she'd met a woman in Paris who knew for certain that American soldiers collected scalps like savages. Another swore she'd heard they'd parade prisoners through city streets so civilians could throw garbage and spit. A third voice insisted the key was staying silent, never letting them know you understood English because that would mark you as a spy and they'd execute you without hesitation. Each warning fed the next, building a picture of what awaited them that grew more horrifying with every retelling. Greta kept one palm flat against her sternum, feeling the sharp corner of that photograph digging into her skin through the thin material. Anneliese. Her daughter was 8 years old now, assuming she'd made it through the winter safely with her grandmother. Dark braids that Greta used to plait every morning before school. A gap between her front teeth that made her smile look mischievous even when she was being serious. The last time Greta had actually held her child was 18 months back, before the Wehrmacht needed auxiliary transport drivers in France, before the Allies started pushing east, before everything that had seemed permanent and certain revealed itself to be nothing but smoke dispersing in wind. The ship made noises that Greta had never heard before, metal grinding and groaning as it forced its way through Atlantic swells. She'd never been on anything larger than a river barge before this journey. Never imagined she'd cross an entire ocean like cargo being shipped, like an object instead of a person, like an enemy instead of a mother who just wanted to go home. The propaganda posters back in Germany had shown American soldiers with exaggerated features that made them look barely human. Cruel mouths always twisted in sneers, hands drawn too large and grasping, eyes that held nothing but predatory hunger. Barbarians who understood nothing of European civilization, who would treat captured Germans the way they treated everything else in their path, with violence and contempt and casual cruelty. Beside Greta sat a younger woman named Liesel, all sharp angles and rigid conviction, who leaned close enough that Greta could feel her breath. Whatever you do, don't show them weakness when we get there. They're like dogs, they can smell weakness and they'll tear you apart for it. Greta nodded because it seemed easier than arguing, but she'd learned something in 3 years of total war. The ones who talked the most about staying strong and not showing fear were usually the ones most terrified underneath all that posturing. The ship's horn sounded somewhere above them, a low, mournful note that seemed to vibrate through the hull itself. All around the cargo hold, women shifted, murmured to each other, reached out to clutch hands in the darkness. After 2 full weeks at sea, breathing stale air and eating whatever minimal rations they were given, they were finally arriving somewhere. Greta's heart hammered so hard against that photograph that she worried it might somehow damage the image, wear away Anneliese's face through sheer percussion. When they finally brought the prisoners up onto the deck, the heat slammed into Greta like a physical blow. Texas, that's what the guards had said. The word itself meant absolutely nothing to Greta except distance, an impossible gulf of ocean and land between herself and everything she'd ever known. Armed soldiers lined the dock where the ship was mooring, but their weapons hung loose and casual from their shoulders. Nobody was snarling or shouting. Nobody had their rifles raised and ready. They were just young men in olive-coloured uniforms watching the prisoners disembark with expressions that Greta couldn't quite interpret. Some looked curious, some looked bored. None of them looked hateful, and that unnerved her more than violence would have. She'd prepared herself for hatred. She didn't know what to do with indifference. Camp Como spread out behind chain-link fencing that glinted in the brutal Texas sun. Row after row of wooden barracks painted a pale yellow that seemed almost obscene in its cheerfulness, like something from a child's picture book rather than a prison. Real buildings with actual walls and roofs, not muddy trenches or bombed-out ruins full of rubble and unexploded ordnance. Greta felt her throat go tight. This had to be temporary, just a holding area where they'd wait before being transferred to the real punishment, whatever form that would take. They marched through the gates in a column of silence. Nobody spat at them. Nobody shouted insults or threw things. The American guards simply directed them forward with economical gestures and minimal words, maintaining professional distance. Inside a processing building that smelled of fresh paint and floor wax, the prisoners were separated into smaller groups. Greta found herself standing in front of a folding table where an American woman sat with a clipboard and an expression of bone-deep tiredness. The woman wore a Red Cross uniform, and when she looked up, her face struck Greta as unremarkable. Thin features, drawn skin, dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many long shifts without proper rest. But her gaze was direct and somehow kind. She said something in English that moved too fast for Greta to catch even the general meaning. Then she switched to German, speaking it carefully with a slight accent that softened the harder consonants. Name? Greta's voice came out rougher than she'd intended when she answered. Muller, Greta Muller. The Red Cross woman wrote it down in neat script. Date of birth? Greta answered automatically, reciting numbers while her mind stayed focused on keeping that photograph hidden and secure. But when she shifted her weight slightly, the picture slipped. Just a fraction of movement, just enough. It tumbled out from inside her sock and landed face up on the concrete floor. Time seemed to slow down until Greta could count her own heartbeats. She stared at Annalise's face looking up from the ground, completely vulnerable and exposed. Her breath stopped in her chest. This was it, the moment everything would fall apart. They'd confiscate the photograph, question her about why she'd hidden it, use it somehow as leverage or punishment. The American woman whose name tag read Ruth bent down smoothly and picked up the photograph, holding it carefully between her fingers like it was something precious rather than contraband. She studied the image of the little girl with dark braids for what felt like an eternity, while Greta's entire body went rigid with dread. Then Ruth looked up, met Greta's eyes directly, and spoke in that same careful German with its soft accent. She's beautiful. She held the photograph out, offering it back. You'll see her again. Greta's hand actually trembled when she reached out to take it. The photograph felt heavier now somehow, impossible and real at the same time. She searched Ruth's face for any sign of mockery, for cruelty disguised as temporary kindness, but found only a sadness so deep it seemed to mirror something in Greta's own chest. Thank you, Greta whispered, and the words felt like some kind of treason against everything she'd been taught her entire adult life about Americans and what to expect from them. That night, she lay on an actual mattress in a barracks that had screens on the windows and a roof that didn't leak when it rained. She tucked the photograph under her pillow and stared up at the wooden ceiling planks. All around her, other women whispered their confusion and mounting suspicion. Liesel's voice cut through the darkness with sharp certainty. They're softening us up, making us weak and compliant. Don't trust any of it. But Greta couldn't stop thinking about Ruth's hands, the gentle, deliberate way she'd returned something that any guard anywhere would have been justified in confiscating. If that small mercy was genuine, what else might be real? And if everything they'd been told about Americans was a lie, what other lies had she swallowed whole without questioning? The thought terrified her more than any direct threat of violence ever could. The laundry detail became Greta's daily anchor, the rhythm that held her together when nothing else made sense. 6 days every week she stood at industrial sinks with 5 other women, scrubbing olive-green American uniforms and white cotton sheets until her hands turned red and raw. The work was completely mindless, perfectly repetitive, exactly what she needed while her thoughts circled endlessly around the same impossible questions. Why weren't they being punished? Why wasn't anyone screaming at them or beating them or starving them the way she knew German camps treated their prisoners? The food arrived 3 times daily on a schedule you could set a watch by. Oatmeal in the mornings, sometimes with a little sugar or milk. Sandwiches at noon with actual meat and vegetables. Some kind of protein and potatoes in the evenings, occasionally with gravy. Nobody went hungry. Nobody got beaten for minor infractions. The guards maintained their professional distance, treating the prisoners with bureaucratic efficiency and a notable absence of cruelty that Greta found more disorienting than outright violence would have been. At least violence would have made sense. At least hatred would have been understandable. This indifference, this casual decency, she didn't have a framework for processing it. Ruth appeared at the laundry station most afternoons, always carrying that clipboard, ostensibly checking on supply levels or asking if anyone needed medical attention. She never lingered longer than necessary, never pushed for conversation or forced interaction. But Greta found herself watching the Red Cross woman with increasing curiosity. Other American staff rotated through on different shifts, different faces with different voices, but Ruth was a constant presence. And there was something about the careful way she spoke German, the slight hesitation before certain words, that nagged at Greta's ear. She'd been a teacher before the war, trained to notice linguistic patterns, and Ruth's German wasn't learned from textbooks or army language courses. One afternoon in late September, while Greta was hanging sheets on the outdoor clothesline, she overheard Ruth speaking with another Red Cross worker near the fence. The conversation was entirely in English, moving too fast for Greta to follow completely, but certain words emerged clear enough to catch. Germany, Frankfurt, parents, and underneath the English words, a grief in Ruth's voice that transcended any single language. That night, lying in her bunk while other women snored or whispered around her, Greta pieced it together. Ruth's German wasn't learned, it was native, polished smooth by childhood use and then overlaid with American English sometime later. She was one of us, Greta thought, and the realization landed with uncomfortable weight. One of us and one of them simultaneously, both and neither, standing in some impossible middle ground that Greta couldn't quite fathom the dimensions of. October arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and news that rippled through the camp like electricity through water. A shipment had arrived. Items from the Red Cross, donated by American church groups apparently. The camp commander would be making an announcement after the evening meal. Greta sat on a wooden bench outside the mess hall with 24 other women, watching the sun sink low over the flat Texas landscape. The light here was different than in Germany, bigger somehow, more exposed and relentless. She missed the forests back home, missed the close grey skies, missed Annalise with an ache that had become so constant it felt like part of her breathing pattern. The commander was a middle-aged man with a slight paunch and tired eyes who spoke through a translator, his words coming slow and deliberate. The Geneva Convention mandates that prisoners of war retain personal dignity. We have received donated items, personal care supplies, lipstick, powder compacts, hand cream. You may accept these items if you choose. Nobody will be forced to take anything. Complete silence dropped like a stone into still water. Greta felt the shock move through the assembled women in a visible wave. Makeup, feminine things, items that belonged to a world before war, before capture, before they'd all been reduced to numbers and identical uniforms. Liesel rose from her seat, spine absolutely rigid. Her voice rang out in German, translated haltingly by the interpreter who seemed uncomfortable with her vehemence. This is corruption. You want us to forget who we are, to become soft and complicit. The commander listened to the translation with an expression that might have been weariness or might have been a kind of respect. You're prisoners, not animals. The choice is yours to make. The supplies were distributed in the mess hall, small cardboard boxes set out on tables, women filing past in a line to take what they wanted or nothing at all. Greta watched the procession, watched women hesitate with their hands hovering over items, reach out tentatively, pull back as if burned. Some took nothing at all, their faces set hard against temptation. Others grabbed items quickly and furtively, as if the boxes might vanish like mirages if they moved too slowly. When Greta reached the table, Ruth stood there organizing the supplies with methodical care. Their eyes met and held. Ruth gestured toward the boxes, her expression carefully neutral, offering without pushing or pressuring. Greta's hand hovered over several items, a compact, a small pot of cream. Then her fingers settled on a single tube of lipstick, red, but not bright aggressive red, something deeper and more subdued. The kind of red a schoolteacher might wear on an ordinary day in an ordinary world that no longer existed. Good choice, Ruth said quietly in German. Greta closed her fingers around the tube. It weighed almost nothing but felt impossibly heavy in her palm. Why? The question came out before she could stop herself. Why do you do this? Give us these things. Ruth's expression shifted, something painful moving beneath the controlled surface. Because when we forget people are human, we create camps. She said it simply, as if it were the most obvious truth in the world, on both sides. We create camps on both sides when we forget. Greta returned to the barracks with the lipstick burning a metaphorical hole in her pocket. All around her, women argued in harsh whispers that cut through the evening air. Half had taken nothing at all, viewing the gesture as manipulation or moral weakness. The other half clutched their small treasures like lifelines to a world they'd thought was lost forever. The barracks felt fractured, split along invisible fault lines that kept widening. That night, alone in the latrine after everyone else had gone to bed, Greta unscrewed the lipstick tube with shaking hands. The mirror above the sink was cracked, distorting her reflection into disconnected fragments. She raised the tube toward her lips and paused. 3 years. 3 full years since she'd worn lipstick. Since she'd attended a school assembly or walked Annalise to kindergarten like a normal mother in a normal world where such things were possible. She applied the colour slowly, carefully, watching her fragmented reflection. The face looking back wasn't prisoner number 724, wasn't faceless enemy, just a woman. 32 years old, still breathing, still here, still herself somehow. For the first time since capture, Greta came close to smiling. December brought cold that seeped through the barracks walls despite the best efforts of the heating system, and it brought news that changed absolutely everything. The camp commander announced a new policy. Prisoners could write letters home. They would be censored, of course. Every single word would be read and approved and potentially rejected, but they would actually be delivered through neutral Switzerland and the International Red Cross under Geneva Convention protocols. Greta sat on her bunk that evening with a piece of paper and a stubby pencil, staring at the blank page until her eyes burned from not blinking. Around her, other women hunched over their own letters, some writing furiously as if afraid the opportunity might be rescinded, others frozen solid like she was. What could she possibly say? How did you compress 18 months of separation, of war, of capture and profound confusion into a single censored page that would pass through multiple sets of hands before maybe, possibly, eventually reaching your daughter? She thought of Annalise's face in that photograph, tried to imagine her at 9 years old now instead of 8. Taller, probably. Maybe the gap in her teeth had closed. Perhaps she'd forgotten what her mother's voice sounded like. The pencil trembled in Greta's grip. She wrote the address first, focusing on something concrete and actionable. Her mother's house in Bavaria, the only place Annalise would be staying. Then she began writing, each word feeling simultaneously inadequate and enormous. Dearest Annalise, the food here is plain, but there's enough of it. My bed has a real pillow. They let me write to you, which is something I never expected. I think of you every single morning when I wake up, and every night before I go to sleep. I hope you're being good for your grandmother. I hope you remember that I love you. Always, Mama. She didn't mention the lipstick, didn't mention Ruth's unexpected kindness, or the donated supplies, or the creeping, terrifying realization that everything she'd been taught about Americans might be fundamentally wrong. Those truths were too strange, too unbelievable. They'd only worry her mother, confuse Annalise. Better to keep it simple and safe. Other women weren't quite so cautious. Greta overheard fragments of letters being read aloud for approval, some brutally honest, others carefully coded. One woman wrote about the expected terrible treatment and harsh conditions as warned, maintaining the propaganda narrative even from inside the living contradiction. Another described the mess hall food in detailed specificity, the clean water, the medical care when someone got sick, small truths that felt like treason just to speak aloud. 3 days after Greta mailed her letter, Liesl intercepted another prisoner near the latrine. The woman, Margaret, quiet and mouse-like and generally invisible, had written about kindness, about respect from the guards, about feeling safer here than she had during the last year of the war back in Germany. Liesl had somehow obtained a copy of the letter, and now she stood in the centre of the barracks waving it like evidence of profound betrayal. Listen to this. Liesl's voice cut through the evening, quiet like a blade. They treat us with dignity. The Red Cross woman speaks beautiful German and remembers all our names. She practically spat the words. This is how it starts. This is how they corrupt us. Make us forget what we're supposed to be fighting for. Margaret's face went absolutely white. We're not fighting anymore. We lost. We're prisoners now. We're still German. Liesl advanced toward her, and Greta saw something wild and desperate in the young woman's eyes, the same desperation that had been building for weeks underneath the surface. That lipstick, those letters, all of it. It's all designed to make us weak, to make us betray our own people. She lunged suddenly for Greta's footlocker, yanked it open before anyone could react or stop her. The lipstick tube rolled out onto the floor. Liesl snatched it up, raised her fist high like she was going to smash it against the wall or the floor. Greta moved without conscious thought, caught Liesl's wrist mid-swing. Number. For a long moment they stood locked together, Liesl shaking with fury, Greta holding firm despite her own fear. Around them other women had risen from their bunks. Some sided with Liesl, Greta could see it clearly in their faces. Others moved closer to Margaret, to Greta, forming a silent protective barrier between ideologies. It's just lipstick, Greta said quietly but firmly. It doesn't make us anything except human. Human? Liesl's laugh was jagged and broken. They gave us makeup while our country burns, while our men die in trenches and our cities get bombed into rubble. And you think that makes them good? Makes us human? I think it means we're still ourselves, Greta said. Not just numbers, not faceless enemies, still ourselves underneath everything else. One of the older women, Frau Weber, grey-haired and steady and generally respected, stepped forward and gently pried the lipstick from Liesl's clenched grip. She handed it back to Greta with deliberate care, then turned to face the entire room. We can hate what's happened to us. We can hate this entire war and everything it's taken from us. But we don't have to hate ourselves for surviving it. The tension held for another heartbeat, then finally cracked and dissipated. Liesl stumbled back to her bunk, her face crumpling inward. Some women followed her, murmuring support and solidarity. Others returned to their letters, their small, stubborn acts of maintaining connection across an ocean that felt wider and more impossible with every passing day. That night, Greta couldn't sleep at all. She lay in the dark, listening to muffled crying from Liesl's corner, to the whispered conversations that never quite stopped, even in the deepest hours. The lipstick sat in her locker, and she understood suddenly with perfect clarity what it had become. Not just colour for lips, but proof. Proof they were still women, still mothers and daughters and teachers and clerks and secretaries. Still people who deserved to exist beyond the narrow roles war had forced on them. 3 months later, in early March, when Texas was starting to warm up again, Ruth found Greta in the laundry room and held out an envelope without saying anything. International postage. Swiss stamps. Greta's hand shook so badly she almost dropped it twice. Inside was a single page in her mother's careful script, and folded within that, a drawing. Crayon on newsprint. A woman with dark hair and a smile, standing in front of a house that looked like their old one. Underneath, in a child's uncertain letters, Mama, from Annalise. Greta pressed the drawing to her chest and wept without trying to hide it or stop it. Ruth stood beside her, not speaking, not touching, just present. And when Greta finally looked up with tears streaming down her face, she saw tears on Ruth's face too. Different grief, maybe. Different loss. But grief nonetheless, the universal language of war. "She remembers you," Ruth said softly in German. Greta nodded, completely unable to speak. For the first time since capture, she felt something beyond mere survival. She felt hope, fragile and terrifying and devastatingly real. April arrived with wildflowers blooming along the camp fence in defiant colours, and it brought an announcement that drained all colour from every face in the compound. Mandatory assembly in the mess hall, a newsreel, footage from Europe. The camp commander's expression was absolute granite as he explained they would be shown what Allied forces had discovered when they liberated the camps. The camps. Not labour camps or relocation facilities, or any of the euphemisms the propaganda had used. The camps. Greta filed into the mess hall with the others, her stomach already churning with formless dread. She'd heard whispers over the months, rumours that filtered through even the most heavily censored news. Labour camps where enemies of the state had been sent. Concentration camps, places for dealing with problems. But propaganda had always dismissed such talk as exaggeration, as Allied lies specifically designed to justify their own atrocities and make Germany look barbaric. The lights dimmed, the projector whirred to life, throwing harsh light onto the white screen. The first images were of gates, iron gates with words worked into the metal in elaborate script. Arbeit macht frei. Work sets you free. Greta recognised the phrase immediately from 100 party posters, 100 speeches about the dignity of labour and the purification of the state through productive work. Then the camera moved inside those gates. Bodies, piles and piles of bodies, skeletal forms, naked, stacked like cordwood waiting to be burned, living people who looked like animated corpses, eyes huge in skulls covered with paper-thin skin, children with distended bellies and hollow faces that couldn't possibly be real, ovens, massive ovens with rails for sliding bodies inside, train cars still packed with the dead, preserved by cold, mass graves being bulldozed by the hundreds, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. The narrator's voice was clinical and detached, listing numbers that stopped making sense. Thousands dead here, tens of thousands there. The camera showed Allied soldiers openly weeping as they tried to help survivors too weak to stand on their own. Showed German civilians from nearby towns being marched through the camps at gunpoint, forced to witness what had been done in their names. Greta felt the entire room tilt and spin. Beside her, someone was actively retching. Someone else sobbed without restraint. Many women sat in frozen silence, faces slack with shock so complete it looked like catatonia. "This is Allied propaganda," a voice whispered desperately. "Staged. It has to be staged. They wouldn't. We wouldn't." But Greta couldn't look away from the screen, couldn't unsee the children's faces, the mountains of eyeglasses and shoes and human hair. The medical experiment victims with their tortured bodies. And she knew with the same bone-deep certainty she'd felt when Ruth returned her photograph that this was real. This had actually happened. Her country had done this, built these places, operated them, killed hundreds of thousands, maybe millions. The lipstick in her pocket felt obscene now. How could she accept mercy, dignity, small kindnesses when her nation had constructed factories specifically designed for mass death? When she'd believed the lies, taught them to her students, sent her own daughter to youth meetings because that's what good German mothers were supposed to do? The lights came back on. Nobody moved. The silence was absolute and suffocating. The camp commander spoke, his voice heavy with something Greta couldn't quite identify. "This is what we fought against. This is why we fought. We thought you should know the truth." Greta stumbled outside into the bright Texas afternoon that seemed completely wrong, too cheerful, too ordinary. Around her, women scattered in every direction, some running blindly to the barracks, others collapsing on benches. The sound of weeping came from everywhere at once. Liesel stood near the fence with both hands gripping the chain link so hard her knuckles had gone bone white, her whole body convulsing with sobs. Not angry sobs this time, broken ones, the kind that came from a worldview shattering into pieces too small and sharp to ever reassemble into anything coherent. Greta found herself at the edge of the compound, staring at nothing in particular. The wildflowers swayed in the breeze. In the distance somewhere, a mockingbird sang its complicated song. The world kept turning as if absolutely nothing had changed, but everything had changed. Everything. Ruth appeared at Greta's side without announcement, silent. They stood together for long minutes, neither one speaking. Finally, Ruth's voice came out quiet and absolutely wrecked. "My grandmother, my cousins, Bergen-Belsen." She stopped, swallowed hard. "My parents escaped in 38. They brought me here when I was 13 years old. I found out last week the rest of them didn't make it." Greta turned to look at her. Ruth's face was wet with tears, but her expression was somehow steady underneath all that grief. "You think I don't know what you carry?" Ruth continued. "I carry it too. Different sides of the same war, same grief. How?" Greta's voice cracked completely. "How do you—" She couldn't finish the question. "How do you show us mercy? How do you treat us like humans after seeing that? How do you bear it?" Ruth met her eyes directly. "The lipstick isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about remembering you're human. Because when we forget that basic fact, when anyone forgets it, we get camps. On both sides. We get ovens and mass graves and children dying by the thousands. The words landed like stones thrown into still water, rippling outward infinitely." Greta thought about the propaganda, the systematic dehumanization, the slow, careful process of making people into things, into problems that needed solving, threats that required eliminating. And she thought about Ruth choosing, every single day, to see prisoners as women, as mothers and daughters, as human beings deserving of basic dignity. "I don't deserve it," Greta whispered. "Any of us. Not after that. Deserving has absolutely nothing to do with it." Ruth's voice was firm despite her tears. "Dignity isn't something you earn. It's something you choose, for yourself and for other people. That's the only way forward that doesn't lead straight back to more camps." That night the barracks was completely silent except for quiet weeping. Nobody used makeup. Nobody wrote cheerful letters. The drawings from children, the photographs of families, the small tokens of ordinary life, all of it felt impossibly tainted now. Impossible to reconcile with what they'd witnessed on that screen. Greta lay awake with the lipstick tube cold against her palm. She wanted desperately to throw it away, wanted to reject every kindness she'd received, punish herself with the same brutality her country had inflicted on millions of innocent people. But Ruth's words kept circling in her mind like birds that wouldn't land. When we forget people are human, we get camps, on both sides. Maybe mercy wasn't about deserving anything. Maybe it was about choosing to break the cycle instead of perpetuating it forever. Choosing to remember humanity even when, especially when, it would be easier and more comfortable to forget. The choice felt completely impossible, and absolutely necessary, and more terrifying than anything she'd faced yet. The weeks after watching that newsreel passed in a grey fog that never quite lifted. Greta moved through her days mechanically, performing all the required actions: laundry, meals, sleep. But she felt fundamentally disconnected from all of it, as if she were watching herself from some great distance, observing a stranger going through the motions. The lipstick stayed buried at the very bottom of her footlocker underneath everything else. Letters from Annalise went unanswered because what could she possibly say now? How could she explain to her 9-year-old daughter that everything they'd believed, everything they'd been taught, was built on mass graves? Around her, the entire camp had transformed. Women who'd begun cautiously smiling, who'd started to laugh occasionally, who'd reclaimed tiny pieces of themselves, had retreated back into defensive silence. The barracks felt like a tomb. Even the spring weather, warm and bright and full of new growth bursting from the Texas soil, seemed like deliberate mockery of their internal devastation. One evening in late April, Greta sat alone on the barracks steps watching the sun sink low toward the horizon. She didn't hear Ruth approach until the other woman settled beside her, leaving careful space between them, but offering quiet presence without demanding anything. They sat in complete silence for several long minutes. Then Ruth spoke, her voice soft and measured. "My grandparents owned a bookshop in Frankfurt. Small place, nothing fancy. My father used to tell me about it, how they'd stay open late on Friday nights, how the whole neighborhood would come to argue about literature and philosophy and politics." She paused, gathering herself. "My mother's family were musicians. Her brother, my uncle, played violin in the Berlin Philharmonic. First chair." Ruth's hands were clasped tight in her lap, knuckles white. "They didn't leave when my parents did. Thought it would all blow over eventually. Thought they were German first, before anything else. That their neighbours would protect them because they'd lived side by side for generations." Greta listened without daring to interrupt or speak. "Bergen-Belsen," Ruth said flatly. "All of them. The Red Cross confirmed it 3 weeks ago with documentation." "I'm so sorry," Greta said, and the words felt grotesquely inadequate, meaningless in the face of that kind of loss. "You think I don't know what you're carrying?" Ruth turned to look at her directly. "I carry it too. Different sides of the same terrible war. Same questions about how people we loved, countries we believed in, became capable of that level of systematic evil." Greta's throat closed completely. "How do you—" She stopped, forced herself to start again. "How do you not hate us? How is that even possible?" Ruth was quiet for a long time, considering. "Some days I do hate you," she said with devastating honesty. "Some days I look at all of you and all I can see are their faces. My grandmother who baked the best apple cake. My cousin Sarah who was only 6 years old and loved fairy tales." Her voice cracked, but she pushed through. "But then I remember that hate is exactly what created those camps in the first place, on both sides. And if I let it consume me completely, if I stop seeing you as human, then I become part of the same endless cycle." She reached over slowly and gently took Greta's hand. "The lipstick isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't occur. It's about remembering you're human beings. Because when we forget that fundamental fact, when anyone forgets it anywhere, we get camps, we get ovens, we get children in mass graves, we get everything we just saw on that screen." Greta felt something break wide open in her chest, some final defense she'd been maintaining. "But after what we did, what my country did, how can I possibly accept mercy? How can any of us justify it?" "Because mercy isn't about deserving," Ruth said with absolute firmness. "It's about choosing who we're going to be tomorrow. The camps happened because people systematically stopped seeing each other as human. The only way forward, the only way that doesn't lead straight back to more of the same, is to refuse to do that same thing ourselves. The words settled into Greta like seeds being planted in soil. Not comfortable, not easy, but fundamentally true in a way she couldn't deny. The next morning, Greta found Liesel alone behind the laundry building, sitting with her back pressed against the wall, staring at nothing with empty eyes. The young woman looked completely hollowed out, decades older than her actual 22 years. Greta had heard through whispers that Liesel had stopped eating regularly, stopped speaking to anyone, spent most nights awake staring at the ceiling until dawn. Greta sat down beside her without asking permission or announcing herself. Didn't speak, didn't offer empty platitudes, just sat there in solidarity. After what might have been an hour of shared silence, Liesel's voice came out barely audible. My whole family, Dresden, the firebombing. She stopped, swallowed with visible difficulty. I thought if I believed hard enough, if I stayed loyal enough to everything we were taught, their deaths would mean something. Would be for some greater purpose. I know, Greta said quietly. But it was all lies. Liesel's face crumpled inward. They died for nothing but lies. I hated people for lies. She couldn't continue, the words dissolving into broken sounds. Greta reached into her pocket and pulled out the lipstick tube. Held it out carefully. This isn't about being German or American. It's not about forgetting or forgiving what happened. It's about deciding who we choose to be tomorrow and the day after that. Liesel stared at the tube as if it were something completely alien, incomprehensible. How can you possibly use that, after everything we saw? Because Ruth was right, Greta said. When we stop being human, when we let ourselves become nothing but our worst moments and our worst actions, that's when we create more camps, more ovens, more children in graves, more of everything we just witnessed. She pressed the lipstick firmly into Liesel's shaking hand. This is me choosing to still be a person, to still be Annaliese's mother, to still be someone who can eventually teach her daughter something true and worth knowing. Liesel's fingers closed slowly around the tube. She didn't use it, didn't open it, but she didn't throw it away either, just held it like an anchor in heavy seas. Over the following weeks, something shifted incrementally in the camp. Not healing, that was far too strong a word. The wounds were too deep, too fresh. But women began cautiously emerging from the fog. They organised a small memorial service, acknowledging their own losses from Allied bombing and their families' suffering, while also acknowledging the camp's victims in the same breath. No easy forgiveness. No pretending the horror could somehow be erased or undone. Just shared grief and the tentative, terrifying recognition that they could carry both sorrow for what was done and determination not to perpetuate it themselves. On May 8th, news rippled through the camp like lightning. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was officially over. Greta sat alone at a table in the mess hall and pulled out paper and a pencil. This time the words came easier, flowing from some place deep inside that had been locked tight for months. Dearest Anneliese, I want you to know the truth about everything, about the propaganda we believed without questioning, about the camps our country built and operated, about the lipstick the Americans let me keep when they could have taken it, about the mercy I didn't deserve but received anyway. I want you to grow up knowing that mercy is real even when cruelty exists, that small kindnesses matter, especially when everything else is broken beyond repair, that we have a choice every single day about who we choose to be. That's what I learned here in Texas. That's what I'm bringing home to you when I finally can, your mother who loves you more than anything.